It was November 3rd, 1943. Flight Lieutenant Bill Reid and his crew of 6 took off from England on a bombing mission to Düsseldorf, Germany. Hours later, their Avro Lancaster was torn apart by enemy fire. The nose section was blown away, the windscreen shattered, and Reid himself was hit in the face and shoulder. His navigator lay bleeding beside him. The aircraft was half destroyed, plunging through the night sky. Most pilots would have turned back, but Reid didn't. Despite the blood freezing on his face and the wind roaring through the open cockpit, he pushed forward, determined to finish the job. That night, he would do what no one thought possible: complete the mission, drop his bombs, and somehow bring his crippled aircraft and his crew home alive. Flight Lieutenant Bill Reid was 21 years old. He had joined the Royal Air Force in 1941, trained as a pilot, and by late 1943 he was flying heavy bombers with 61 Squadron based at Syerston, Nottinghamshire. He was young, quiet, and relatively inexperienced compared to some of the veteran crews around him. This was only his 10th operational mission, but Reid had already earned a reputation among his squadron. He was steady, reliable, the kind of pilot who didn't panic when things went wrong. His aircraft that night was an Avro Lancaster, one of the most formidable bombers in the Royal Air Force. The Lancaster was a 4-engine heavy bomber, powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, capable of carrying up to 14,000 pounds of bombs. It had a wingspan of over 100 feet and required a crew of 7 men to operate: pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, and 2 gunners. Reid's crew had been together for months. They trusted each other. His navigator, Flying Officer Jim Jeffries, sat just behind and to the right of Reid in the cockpit. The bomb aimer, Sergeant Les Rolton, would lie in the nose during the attack run. In the rear turret sat Sergeant Alan Jeffries, Jim's younger brother. The mid-upper gunner was Sergeant Joe Norris. The wireless operator, Sergeant Jim Mann, monitored communications. And the flight engineer, Sergeant Frank Emerson, stood beside Reid, managing the engines and fuel. They were a good crew, experienced enough to handle trouble, young enough to believe they were invincible. The mission briefing had taken place earlier that evening. The target was Düsseldorf, an industrial city in western Germany. The objective was simple: drop bombs on factories and rail yards, disrupt German war production, and return home. It was a standard night raid. Over 200 bombers from various squadrons would participate. The risks were well known. German night fighters prowled the skies, guided by radar stations on the ground. Anti-aircraft flak filled the air over every major city. Searchlights swept the darkness, hunting for bombers. Losses were expected. Every crew knew that some aircraft wouldn't come back. Reid and his crew took off from Syerston at 5:32 p.m. The Lancaster climbed into the evening sky, joined the bomber stream, and headed east across the North Sea. The flight was smooth at first. The weather was clear. Visibility was good. They crossed the English coast, then the dark waters below, and finally entered German airspace. By 11 p.m., they were deep inside enemy territory. The bomber stream had begun to spread out. Some aircraft flew higher, others lower. Reid held his altitude at 15,000 feet, maintaining formation discipline. The crew stayed alert. The gunners scanned the darkness for enemy fighters. The navigator tracked their position, calling out headings and checkpoints. Everything was going according to plan. Then, at 11:47 p.m., just as they were approaching the initial point for their bomb run, the German night fighter struck. The attack came without warning. A Messerschmitt Bf 110 night fighter had been stalking them from below, invisible against the black earth. The German pilot waited until he was in perfect position, then opened fire. Cannon shells ripped into the Lancaster's nose. The sound was deafening, a rapid hammering of explosions that tore through metal and plexiglass. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit. The entire front section of the aircraft seemed to come apart. Reid felt something hot slash across his head, then his shoulder. Pain flared immediately. Blood poured down his face, into his eyes, soaking his collar. He couldn't see clearly. His right arm went partially numb. Beside him, the navigator let out a sharp cry and slumped forward over his desk. He'd been hit too. The windscreen was gone, completely shattered. Freezing air at 15,000 feet blasted into the cockpit with hurricane force. The temperature outside was 40 degrees below zero. Now that air was inside the aircraft, tearing at Reid's face, freezing the blood on his skin, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Through the intercom, voices erupted in chaos. "We're hit. We're hit. Nose section's gone. Skipper, are you all right?" Reid wiped blood from his eyes with his left hand and tried to focus. The control column was still in his grip. The engines were still running. The aircraft was still flying barely. But the instruments in front of him were either shattered or spinning uselessly. The compass was gone. The altimeter was cracked. Oil pressure gauges flickered. He looked to his right. The flight engineer, Frank Emerson, was staring at him in shock. "Sir, you're bleeding badly," Emerson shouted over the wind. Reid ignored him. He checked the navigator. Jim Jeffries was conscious but badly wounded, blood spreading across his flight suit. He was trying to speak but couldn't form words clearly. In the nose section, or what was left of it, the bomb aimer, Les Rolton, was somehow still alive. He'd been lying in the nose when the shells hit. By some miracle, he'd only been grazed. But the entire front of the aircraft where he'd been positioned was now a gaping hole. Wires hung loose, metal twisted outward. The cold was unbearable. Reid's mind raced. The standard procedure was clear. If the aircraft was severely damaged and crew members were wounded, you turned back. You aborted the mission. You tried to make it home before the aircraft fell apart, or enemy fighters returned to finish you off. But Reid looked at the compass, or where it had been, and realized they were only minutes from the target. Düsseldorf was close. The entire bomber stream was converging on the city. If they turned back now, the mission would be wasted. The bombs would be jettisoned over empty countryside. All of this, the wounds, the terror, the damage, would be for nothing. He made his decision in seconds. "We're continuing," Reid said into the intercom, his voice steady despite the blood and pain. There was a pause. Then Frank Emerson spoke up. "Skipper, the nose is gone. The navigator's hurt. You're hurt. We should turn back." "We're continuing," Reid repeated. No one argued further. Reid pushed the control column forward slightly, adjusting their heading by instinct and memory. Without the compass or functioning instruments, he had to rely on the stars, the distant glow of searchlights ahead, and his navigator's weakened guidance. Jim Jeffries, barely conscious, managed to gasp out a few corrections. Reid followed them. The cold was unbearable. The wind screamed through the cockpit, drowning out the engine noise. Reid's face was numb. His right shoulder throbbed with every movement. Blood kept running into his eyes. He wiped it away again and again, each time his vision returning just long enough to see the black sky and the faint lights of Germany below. The bomber stream was all around them now, hundreds of Lancasters and Halifaxes converging on Düsseldorf. Searchlights stabbed upward from the city, sweeping back and forth, hunting for targets. Anti-aircraft flak began to burst in the sky, black puffs of smoke and shrapnel that bloomed and faded like deadly flowers. Reid flew straight into it. The Lancaster bucked and shuddered as flak exploded nearby. Shrapnel pinged off the wings and fuselage. One burst went off so close that the entire aircraft tilted sideways. Reid fought the controls, pulling it level again. His right arm screamed in protest, but he kept pulling. "Bomb doors open," he ordered. In the shattered nose, Les Rolton crawled forward to his bomb sight. He could barely hold himself steady. The wind tore at him, but he managed to align the sight with the target below a cluster of factories and rail yards lit up by fires from earlier bomber waves. "Steady," Rolton called out. "Steady. Steady." Reid held the Lancaster as straight as he could. Every second felt like an eternity. Flak burst all around them. Searchlights locked onto other bombers nearby, and German fighters prowled the edges of the stream, picking off stragglers. "Bombs gone," Rolton shouted. The Lancaster lurched upward as 14,000 pounds of high explosives dropped away. Reid immediately banked left, pulling away from the target area. The city below erupted in flames as bombs from the entire stream found their marks. They had done it. Against all logic, against all odds, they had completed the mission. But now came the hardest part, getting home. Reid turned the Lancaster northwest, aiming for England. The aircraft was struggling. The missing nose section created enormous drag. The engines were working harder than they should. Fuel consumption was higher than normal. The freezing wind continued to blast through the cockpit, and Reid's body was shutting down from cold and blood loss. His vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing himself to stay conscious. Beside him, Frank Emerson watched him carefully, ready to grab the controls if Reid passed out. "How far to the coast?" Reid asked, his voice weak. Emerson checked with the wounded navigator. Jim Jeffries, barely able to lift his head, gave a rough estimate. 300 miles. Maybe more. Reid nodded. 300 miles. In a crippled bomber, with no instruments. In the freezing cold, with wounds that should have grounded him. He tightened his grip on the controls and kept flying. Behind them, Düsseldorf burned. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, was England, and between them lay an ocean of night, enemy territory, and 100 ways to die. But Bill Reid had made his choice. He would bring his crew home, or he would die trying. The flight back was a battle against everything. Reid's vision kept fading. Blood loss and cold were dragging him toward unconsciousness. Every few minutes, his head would drop forward, and Frank Emerson would shake his shoulder, shouting his name until Reid snapped awake and gripped the controls again. The freezing wind never stopped. At 15,000 feet, the temperature was deadly, and with no windscreen, the cockpit was an icebox. Reid's face was covered in frozen blood. His lips were cracked and numb. His fingers could barely feel the control column anymore. He flew by muscle memory and sheer willpower. Behind him, the navigator was fading too. Jim Jeffries tried to stay conscious, tried to give Reid headings and landmarks, but his voice grew weaker with each passing minute. The wireless operator, Jim Mann, moved forward to help, reading maps by flashlight and relaying rough navigation points to Reid. The rest of the crew did what they could. The gunners stayed alert, scanning for enemy fighters that might be stalking them in the darkness. The flight engineer monitored the engines, watching fuel levels drop faster than they should. Everyone knew the odds. They were flying a half-destroyed aircraft through enemy airspace with a pilot who was barely conscious. But no one suggested bailing out. If Reid was staying, they were staying. The Lancaster droned westward. Minutes felt like hours. Reid kept his eyes locked on the horizon, or where he thought the horizon was. Without instruments, he had to trust his instincts. Too steep a descent and they'd hit the ground. Too shallow and they'd stall and spin. At one point, another bomber appeared beside them, flying parallel. The crew of that Lancaster stared in disbelief at the shattered nose and missing windscreen. They could see Reid slumped at the controls, blood-soaked and barely moving. For a moment, the two aircraft flew side by side. Then the other Lancaster peeled away, continuing home at a faster speed. Reid flew on alone. Around 1:30 a.m., they crossed out of German airspace. The flak stopped. The searchlights disappeared, but the danger wasn't over. They still had the North Sea to cross, and the aircraft was burning fuel at an alarming rate. If they ran out before reaching England, they'd ditch in the freezing water. No one would survive that. Frank Emerson did the calculations in his head and didn't like the answer. They might make it. They might not. It would be close. Reid didn't ask. He just kept flying. The navigator managed one last effort. Jim Jeffries lifted his head, squinted at the stars and the compass heading that Emerson held for him, and gave Reid a final correction. A few degrees north. Reid adjusted. Then Jeffries collapsed back into his seat, unconscious. The North Sea passed beneath them in blackness. No moonlight. No reference points. Just the sound of 4 Merlin engines and the howling wind. Then, sometime after 2 a.m., a thin line of lighter darkness appeared ahead. The English coast. Emerson saw it first. He grabbed Reid's shoulder and pointed. Reid blinked, focused, and saw it too. Land. Home. But the relief lasted only seconds. Now came the next problem. Landing. Reid keyed the radio. His voice was slurred, barely understandable. He gave his call sign and requested emergency landing clearance. The response came back immediately. He was cleared to land at the nearest available airfield, Syerston, in Norfolk. But landing a Lancaster with no nose section, no instruments, and a half-conscious pilot was nearly impossible. The nose gear might be damaged, the hydraulics might have failed, the brakes might not work, and Reid himself could barely see straight. He began his descent. The crew braced themselves. This was it. If they survived the landing, they'd walk away. If not, it would end here, a few miles from safety. Reid brought the Lancaster down slowly, carefully. He couldn't see the ground clearly through the blood and darkness. The engineer called out altitude estimates based on the one working altimeter: 500 feet, 300, 200. The airfield lights appeared below. A runway. Reid aimed for it. The Lancaster dropped lower. The engines roared. The wind screamed through the open cockpit. 100 feet, 50 feet. Reid pulled back on the controls. The bomber leveled out, floating just above the runway. For a moment it seemed like they might overshoot. Then the wheels touched down. The impact was hard. The Lancaster bounced once, slammed down again, and skidded forward. Metal screeched. The nose gear, somehow still intact, held. The brakes engaged. The aircraft slowed, slower, slower, until finally it rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway. For a long moment, no one moved. The engines ticked and cooled. The wind still howled through the shattered cockpit. Then Frank Emerson reached over and shut down the engines. The propellers spun to a stop. Silence fell. "We made it," someone said over the intercom. His voice was shaking. "We actually made it." Ground crew and medics were already running toward the Lancaster. They climbed up to the cockpit and froze when they saw the damage. The entire nose was gone. The windscreen was shattered. Blood covered the instruments. And in the pilot's seat sat Bill Reid, still gripping the controls, his face a mask of frozen blood. They had to pry his hands off the control column. He couldn't let go on his own. Medics lifted Reid out of the cockpit and onto a stretcher. He was barely conscious. The navigator was pulled out next, also on a stretcher. The rest of the crew climbed out on their own, shaking, exhausted, alive. The ground crew stood around the Lancaster in stunned silence. No one could believe what they were seeing. The nose section was completely destroyed. The windscreen was gone. Wiring hung loose. Metal was twisted and torn. By every logical measure, this aircraft should not have been able to fly, and yet it had. For over 4 hours, through enemy territory, all the way home. One of the ground crew looked up at the shattered cockpit and shook his head. "How the hell did he do that?" he whispered. No one had an answer. Bill Reid woke up in a hospital bed 2 days later. His head was bandaged. His shoulder was in a sling. The doctors told him he'd suffered a deep gash across his scalp, a wound to his right shoulder, and severe frostbite on his face and hands. He'd lost a significant amount of blood. Another few minutes in that frozen cockpit, and he likely would have died from exposure alone. His navigator, Jim Jeffries, was in the bed next to him. He'd been hit by shrapnel in the chest and arm. The wounds were serious but not fatal. He would recover. The rest of the crew had walked away with minor injuries, cuts, bruises, and shock. Against all odds, everyone had survived. The Lancaster, however, had not. Engineers examined the aircraft in the days following the landing and declared it beyond repair. The damage was catastrophic. The entire nose section from the bomb aimer's position forward was gone, torn away by cannon fire. The windscreen was completely destroyed. Electrical systems were shredded, fuel lines had been punctured, control cables were severed or hanging by threads. What baffled the engineers most was how Reid had maintained control at all. Several critical flight systems should have failed. The hydraulics were damaged, the trim tabs were barely functional. The aircraft should have been nearly impossible to fly, let alone navigate across 300 miles of enemy territory and land safely. One engineer filed a report stating simply, "It is difficult to comprehend how this aircraft remained airborne." The debriefing took place once Reid was well enough to speak. Intelligence officers sat beside his hospital bed and asked him to recount everything. Reid's answers were quiet and matter of fact. He described the attack, the damage, the decision to continue, and the flight home. He didn't embellish, he didn't dramatize, he simply told them what had happened. The officers asked why he hadn't turned back. Reid paused, then gave a simple answer. We were close to the target. The mission wasn't finished. When asked how he'd managed to fly without instruments, Reid said he'd used the stars, memory, and his navigator's guidance when possible. When asked how he'd stayed conscious, he admitted he nearly hadn't. Several times he'd felt himself slipping away, but the cold wind and his crew's voices had kept pulling him back. The crew members were interviewed separately. All of them said the same thing. Reid had saved their lives. If he'd panicked, if he'd lost control, if he'd given up at any point during that 4-hour flight, none of them would have made it home. Frank Emerson, the flight engineer, told investigators, "He never wavered. Not once. Even when I thought he was going to pass out, he held that aircraft steady." Leroulton, the bomb aimer who'd been in the destroyed nose section during the attack, said, "I don't know how he did it. I was right there when the shells hit. I thought we were all dead." The formal investigation concluded that Flight Lieutenant Reid had displayed extraordinary courage, determination, and flying skill under the most extreme circumstances. The report noted that most pilots would have and perhaps should have aborted the mission and turned back immediately after the attack. Reid's decision to continue was described as beyond the call of duty. His commanding officer recommended him for the highest possible honour. Within weeks, the recommendation was approved. Bill Reid would be awarded the Victoria Cross, the most prestigious military decoration in the British Commonwealth, given only for acts of exceptional bravery in the face of the enemy. Reid's response, when told, was typically understated. "I was just doing my job," he said. But everyone who saw that shattered Lancaster, everyone who heard the story of that impossible flight, knew it was far more than that. On December 14, 1943, the London Gazette published the official announcement. Flight Lieutenant William Reid had been awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions over Germany on November 3rd. The citation described his outstanding bravery and devotion to duty, and noted that his determination to complete the mission, despite severe wounds and catastrophic damage to his aircraft, was an example of courage, resolution which will be an inspiration to all. Reid was 21 years old. He was one of the youngest recipients of the Victoria Cross during the Second World War. The medal was presented to him by King George VI at Buckingham Palace in early 1944. Reid stood at attention in his dress uniform, his wounds still healing beneath the fabric. The king shook his hand and said simply, "Well done." But Reid's war was far from over. Against the advice of doctors, and despite his injuries, he insisted on returning to operational flying. By July 1944, he was back in the cockpit, flying missions over occupied Europe. His determination was unshakable. He completed his tour of duty, survived the war, and returned to Scotland. After the war, Reid left the Royal Air Force and returned to civilian life. He worked as a farmer in Scotland, living quietly and rarely speaking about that night over Germany. He married, raised a family, and avoided publicity. To those who knew him, he was simply Bill, a kind, humble man who happened to have done something extraordinary. His crew scattered after the war, but they stayed in touch. Jim Jeffries, the navigator who had been wounded beside him, recovered fully and lived a long life. The rest of the crew, Frank Emerson, Les Rolton, Jim Mann, Joe Norris, and Alan Jeffries, all survived the war and returned home to their families. Bill Reid passed away in November 2008 at the age of 86. He was buried with full military honours. His Victoria Cross is now displayed at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, a permanent reminder of one night when a young pilot refused to give up. The story of Flight Lieutenant Bill Reid endures because it represents something fundamental about human courage. It wasn't reckless bravery or dramatic heroism. It was quiet, stubborn determination in the face of impossible odds. It was a refusal to quit when quitting would have been entirely justified. That night, over Germany, Reid had every reason to turn back. He was wounded, his aircraft was destroyed, and his crew was in danger. But he chose to finish what he started, and because of that choice, 7 men came home alive. His story deserves to be remembered. Please help us keep these forgotten stories alive by subscribing to the channel. Only a small percentage of viewers are subscribed. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life.